Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Midlife Revolution. I am your host, Megan Connor. And today we're going to explore a topic that I've been wanting to address ever since Sherry Franke's book came out. In her book, The House of My Mother, Sherry Franke details the narcissistic traits of her mother, Ruby. And later in the book, she compares Ruby to my cousin, Lori Vallow Daybell. And so I wanted to explore that comparison between the two women, their traits that are similar between the two of them, and also to talk about the angle of their LDS beliefs and how their beginnings in Mormonism and the ideas of Mormon culture contributed to the things they believe both about themselves and about the world around them. And who better to help me unpack this discussion than the revolutionary host of Mormon Stories podcast himself, John Dehlin.
Megan.
Welcome, John.
Okay, now wait, if this isn't getting the full band back together, is this like a duet project? What is the analogy here?
This is unplugged.
This is John Lennon and Paul McCartney doing a duet.
That's right.
Without Ringo and George.
Oh, I feel so dishonest now.
No, that's okay.
I feel like we're cheating on our friends.
No. You know, Phil Collins goes back and forth in and out of Genesis. I mean, it's fair. It's, you know.
Yeah. The difference, though, I think, is that, you know, the Beatles, they did their little groups or whatever, but you didn't really see them doing a whole lot of solo work, you know, but every single one of us does our own solo work. So, you know, it's almost like a band of all soloists. And when we come together, it's like synergistic.
It's magic. Anyway, it's a treat to be on your channel. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. My channel members know you've been a great mentor to me. I really appreciate all your leadership and guidance in this space. And, you know, when I started my podcast back in April, I had no clue that it was going to come here. I didn't even really think of YouTube as it being the main thing, but now it definitely is the main thing.
YouTube is the place.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey.
Yeah.
Well, so my viewers know that we got the band back together to do a whole unpack on Sherry Franke's memoir. It was 4.5 hours long. It was awesome. I will link it in the show notes down here.
It's got like 220,000 views. It's crazy.
It is crazy. That's a huge amount. It's amazing. I think there's this intersection between former 8 Passengers fans who really want to know how Sherry's doing now and how she came through that whole time. And also your fans who know that, you know, the Mormon connection in there. So I think it's a space where a lot of people are interested.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's fun. I'll jump at any chance to hang out with you and them. So
yeah, well, we're talking about more stuff coming up here as well. So we definitely have plenty we could talk about and deep dive on. It's exciting.
Yeah, well, this is a fun topic.
Yeah, just to briefly sort of recap, Sherry's memoir, The House of My Mother. I have had it sitting here on my desk ever since we started talking about that episode. I've got lots of little tabs in here for different topics. It's just a wealth of information, not only about the case, but also about the church and just so many different avenues to explore in there. And one of the things I've been talking a lot about on my channel lately is understanding people with narcissistic traits, understanding manipulation, coercive control, and helping people learn how to identify those traits and how to defend against them. So today we're not really going to talk about defending against them, but we definitely can identify some of those traits in both Ruby and Lori. And also the other concept that I've been developing and talking about is the idea that what we're taught growing up in Mormonism really lends us to the possibility of becoming manipulators because we're taught some of those tactics growing up in the church. And I want to explore that angle just a little bit today too, although we won't do a whole deep dive on all of the things. We'll have to save that for a Mormon Stories later.
Well, this is fun, important stuff.
Yeah. I think it's important for people to understand. And I think it's interesting to point out too, a lot of people probably don't know this about you, John, that you have a Ph.D. in psychology. And that was one of the reasons I thought your insight might be valuable on this. But you were telling me that, you weren't really trained in personality disorders. I was really surprised to find that a lot of mental health experts, even licensed clinicians, don't know a lot about narcissism.
Yeah. So just so people know, like, I did a 6-year APA accredited, clinical and counseling psychology Ph.D. at Utah State University. It was from 2009 to 2015, and not once, for example, did I ever have any coursework around marriages.
Oh, wow.
Or like healthy marriages. Not once. I didn't have a supervisor really who was really skilled in marriage counseling. And similarly, the focus was on anxiety disorders, on mood disorders, on, trauma, on eating disorders, things that are perceived as treatable, things for which viable, empirically supported treatments have been found to be efficacious, because obviously you want to train on the stuff where you can make the biggest difference. And so we got almost no training on personality disorders in terms of education. Like, we would have had an entire semester on the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, and we would have had to memorize all of the main diagnoses. But other than that, that's pretty much all of my training on major personality disorders in the 6 years of grad school. And part of me feels like, oh, I should be ashamed about that. But the truth is, that's just the way the training goes. My focus was on obsessive compulsive disorder, and specifically a subtype of OCD called scrupulosity, which is religious OCD. And I do think that, we could talk about this, that Ruby definitely, and possibly, Jody, exhibited some scrupulosity traits.
Yeah.
But anyway, my other expertise is sort of on the nexus of religion and mental health. And if I've got anything that comes to mind during your presentation today, I'll definitely jump in. But I'm sort of thinking of myself as an audience member who's just going to bask in your knowledge, because you actually know more about narcissistic personality disorder than me by far. So I'm just going to enjoy learning from you, and I'll maybe throw in a question here or there, or provide a little input when necessary, or when I feel prompted.
Yeah. When the spirit moves you, John.
Yes, when the spirit moves me.
Yeah, so because I was surrounded by narcissists my entire life, after going through, several years of therapy and EMDR therapy and group therapy, I really wanted to understand all of these different personalities in my life. And so I started researching personality disorders, specifically narcissism, and also just the characteristics and traits that are similar between different personality disorder types, in an effort to try to understand my people, so that I could then learn how to interact with them in ways that were not going to hurt me or damage me. And so by understanding those disorders and those traits, I've been able to sort of come up with my own way of, different tactics and techniques I can use to protect myself, because boundaries don't work well with people with personalities. They tend to not honor boundaries. They tend to not really understand the impact of their actions and their words on the people around them. So it can be harmful. So I've dug pretty deep into understanding all of that, and I think we'll find some common ground and some common language for sure.
For sure. As we're talking about this, there's 2 books that come to mind. I really like this idea that you've helped propagate in our community, which is that there's probably some connection between common narcissistic traits and kind of narcissistic organizations.
Yes.
There is such a thing as organizations that exhibit narcissistic traits. And
Absolutely.
I think high demand religions in general can often meet criteria for narcissism. And I think the
Absolutely.
Mormon Church, depending on your interactions with it, can definitely meet criteria. So 2 books that come to mind that I just want to recommend everybody. One is the book Recovering Agency by Luna Lindsay. It's called Lifting the Veil of Mormon Mind Control. And it is about undue influence.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this idea of a narcissist wielding undue influence is very compatible with the classic traits of high demand religions or cults.
Yes.
And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. The other book that I'm looking for back on my shelf is Stephen Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control. Those are 2 books that I would refer anyone to if they're trying to sort of explore narcissistic traits with the potentiality of narcissistic religions.
Yeah, definitely.
Recovering Agency?
Recovering Agency. I haven't read that one yet. It's on my list, but I have read Stephen Hassan's book, and I did also take his course, and your course, the course the 2 of you developed together about deconstructing after Mormonism and combating the mind control of Mormonism. And I found it so incredibly helpful because it gave me some vocabulary to talk about the things I was experiencing in the church, but I didn't really know how to describe it or how to, explain it to other people. And so taking that course and seeing especially the audience participation, some of the comments of individuals who were there at the course of their experiences in Mormonism and the things that were harmful to them, that was really, really helpful to me. And I definitely recommend that to anybody. And of course, Stephen Hassan's BITE model that he developed as a means of identifying organizations that could be on the spectrum of harmful or culty. And I've used that BITE model in discussions with lots of people, including the Jehovah's Witnesses when they come to my door about, is the organization that you're in healthy or unhealthy? And you can even apply it to partnerships, relationships, businesses, all of that. And I found that really, really helpful in my understanding and talking about these things.
Absolutely. So this is Combating Cult Mind Control by Dr. Stephen Hassan, America's leading cult expert. This was kind of his first book. This is the 30th anniversary edition, so it's been out a long time.
Yeah.
And he has a second one called Freedom of Mind, which is how to help loved ones leave controlling people, cults, and beliefs.
Yeah, that's the one that I've read.
Yeah.
That's a great one. Okay, well, I have this silly little acronym that I use when I talk about these traits. And if you think of somebody, who sort of puts on a veneer in public, this public persona that is just very sparkly. So here's my little acronym: UNGLEAMIE.
Nice.
I think
I love it. UNGLEAMIE.
Yeah.
How could I ever forget that?
I think it touches on each one of the traits that are really specific to narcissistic personalities. Now, I just always have to start this conversation by saying, of course, I am not a licensed mental health professional, and I don't ever use this information to try and diagnose anybody, nor should you. This is for informational purposes, and understanding these traits helps us to relate to these people. But just because somebody has some of these traits doesn't mean they have a personality disorder. And it doesn't mean they have a specific personality disorder. That's something, we leave up to a professional diagnostician, but even they get it wrong sometimes. So this is really just for educational purposes. But I think the number one thing that I see throughout the different types of narcissism is an inability to accept responsibility for their actions. And that's the kind of thing that's sad about the disorder. And one of the reasons why most people who have these traits don't go and seek help is because they don't really think there's anything wrong with what they're doing or how they're acting towards others. And then a need for constant external validation or attention. They tend to be grandiose. In other words, they talk about big ideas and big plans and how important they are. They lack empathy, which is that inability to understand how their words and actions affect other people. They tend to be entitled, meaning like the rules don't really apply to them. They don't like to wait in line. They don't think that they should have to go through the same things that normal people go through. It makes me think of my Uncle Barry with the lower 95 concept. They tend to be very arrogant. In other words, thinking
That's
that
Lori's. Is that Lori's dad?
yeah,
Okay.
Lori's dad,
Yeah.
Barry. Yeah. They tend to be very arrogant, thinking that they know better than other people. For example, Lori thinking that she has the law acumen that she needs to represent herself in court. And they tend to be deeply insecure. In fact, most of these traits that they have, all of these manipulations are developed as a mask for their deep insecurity and for their desire to never be discovered as being insecure. They're terrified that people are going to find out that they're actually very, very insecure. And then they tend to be exploitative, which just means their relationships are pretty transactional. They will use people in situations for what they need them for, and then discard the person or leave the situation without any regard for how anybody else feels about it. So we'll come back and talk about some of these.
So where's the M? I'm just kidding.
Oh man, I did leave out the M, didn't I?
Is there an M?
Manipulative.
Oh, that's an important one.
It is important.
All right. I was just making sure I wasn't going crazy.
I have to redo my slide. Yes, thank you. I mean, this is one of those ADHD things that I'm like, am I done? Yeah, I'm done.
No, let's do yeah, cover manipulative. That's important.
Yeah, I mean, all of these traits lead to someone who's going to manipulate. They want to manipulate the situation, they want to manipulate the person, and that's really the harmful thing behind it is the manipulation. And all of these traits are somewhat controlling.
Yeah.
And
That's really good. I love that acronym. Nice work.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll fix my slide so it doesn't look silly.
So if we were going to just as a case study in organizational narcissism, I'm going to just run through this and look at it from maybe a critical eye towards the Mormon Church, just a sanity check.
Look at that magic. All right. So talking about these traits in relation to the Mormon Church.
Yeah. So I just thought I'd sanity check and see which of these criteria can fairly be applied to one's experience with the church. And of course, people's experiences will vary depending on who your leadership is and where you live. And so I don't even believe there's one Mormon experience, but I'll just apply my experience, which I view as relatively positive, with the exception of my excommunication and my mission, I guess. So Mormon Church, you unable to accept responsibility. I mean, there is the Down H. Oaks statement that the church does not apologize. And in fact, whether it's the priesthood ban or, LGBT suicides or the Mountain Meadows massacre, the church has a hard time apologizing. So definitely the church is a grade A U as it comes to UNGLEAMIE. Okay, the second one is need for constant external validation and attention. I mean, yeah, I think what comes to mind is like the helping hands yellow vests that they wear whenever they do like disaster cleanup or whatever. I do think the church loves external validation and attention. I think we all do. I think every human's born starving for attention. That's probably the way we help prevent our own neglect. But I'd say the church is definitely an A when it comes to validation and attention. Respond to each of those.
Yeah. So to just go back to the validation and attention, I agree with you that we are kind of hardwired to need validation and attention for the survival, right? And so from a baby, we know how to call attention to our needs, and we constantly do that. I feel like the problem is within Mormonism that we need at some point to learn how to self-validate. We need to learn how to meet our own needs and to have our own sense of self and our own belief in our own, abilities to solve problems, etc. And I think one of the issues with Mormonism, growing up Mormon, is that we learn that we have to go to our bishop in order to be declared worthy. And so that's a sort of external validation. And the other is like when we are keeping commandments in order to be acceptable to God, that's another sense of external validation. And I don't know about you, but it left me, feeling like I wasn't worthy unless the bishop said I was.
Yeah, for sure. The Mormon bishop is the broker to someone's relationship with God and Jesus and to their own self-worth, 100%. To the
Yeah.
point of they decide if you're worthy to get baptized. They decide if you're worthy to advance in young men's or young women's. They decide if you're worthy to go to the temple. Yeah. They
And
can pronounce you
also,
clean, really.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they do that in the temple as well. They pronounce you clean, right? But you have to keep that. You have to keep your covenants in order for it to be valid. The other point is, I remember when they added that final question onto the temple recommend interview, where they asked you if you believed you were worthy to go to the temple, because before we didn't really have a say in it,
And I'm not sure that was saying you're the final decision maker. I think it was adding an extra opportunity to exclude you.
Well, yes, I definitely saw it that way. It was like, okay, we've gone through all these questions in the interview, and assuming that you've answered everything truthfully, which we know not everyone does, right? Now we're going to give you an opportunity to confess to anything that we might not have covered in these other questions. Do you consider yourself worthy? Well, I do, except, there is this one other thing, so I didn't find that empowering.
and we all know that if the stake president or bishop don't think you're worthy, but you think you're worthy, they win.
Yeah, that's the other odd thing, is that I've been in recommend interviews more than once where it was very clear that the person interviewing me believed that I needed to confess something. And so they kept kind of pushing on it, and eventually relented, right? But if they really don't think that I'm worthy, they can say, you know what, sister, I think you have some things you need to repent of, and I'm going to withhold your recommend for now. Never mind that your daughter's wedding is next week, or that your son's going on a mission, or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, all right.
Well, I don't want to drag it down. Grandiose. I mean, the church is nothing if not grandiose. I mean, it's the one true church on the face of the earth, led directly by God and Jesus. And, its members become gods and goddesses someday. Like, is there literally anything more grandiose?
Well, I think the only thing more grandiose than that is claiming to be the one true religion on the earth, and all the other religions are wrong. And, so it does. I've often thought about this as someone who grew up outside of Utah. I remember when I would go to Utah and visit my cousins, I remember having this conversation with my sister at one point, like, man, sometimes Utah Mormons seem really arrogant because they seem like they're very superior to everyone. I think that grandiosity and arrogance that we're going to get to in a second, they go together, because it's like, well, I have the truth and you don't. And so I don't consider you as an equal.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. As far as empathy goes, I mean, I think I wouldn't want to say the Mormon church doesn't have empathy, but when it comes to like women being second-class citizens, racism, people of color, the LGBTQ community, each time they were forced into developing empathy for those groups by critics and by the media. And it's hard to trust that they really care. And I think that's exemplified by how much progress the church was making on LGBTQ issues only after they were bludgeoned over the head with the suicide epidemic in the 2010s, only to sort of backtrack and become even more severe against the trans community once the public perceptions kind of moved back the other way. I think the church does lack empathy, especially for marginalized groups.
Definitely. And they've been shamed into empathy, forced empathy, as you're saying, like Sam Young, advocating for parents to be present in the interviews with their children. Then they excommunicated him, but then they implemented that policy anyway. So it was like they had to be forced to do the right thing. They got rid of the person who forced them to do the right thing. then they did the right thing. So is that really empathy?
No,
I don't think so.
it's kind of image management, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's damage control. That's
Which I
all it
think
is.
probably fits into your acronym, image control,
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah, like manipulation includes manipulating your image or people's perception of you in order to hide, your shadow traits, the things about you that you don't like.
Yeah.
So, my grandfather said at least one good thing. He said, "A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." So, I don't think that the church being forced to make social changes their actual opinion or their actual ability to understand the experiences of their members.
Yeah.
And that's kind of been my argument, for quite a while, that the 15 sitting in their ivory tower, literal ivory tower in Salt Lake, I really don't think they have any clue what their individual members go through on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
kind of hard to empathize with them when you don't know that about them.
Yeah.
So,
I'll just quickly say, entitled, yes, arrogant, yes, manipulative, kind of insecure. I don't know. I guess you could probably dig for insecurity. I don't think the church necessarily comes off in its public image as insecure. But you could definitely argue it's exploitative of its members, of its
yeah,
missionaries, of its women, you know, definitely
yeah,
exploitative. I didn't mean to
firing
just speed through it, but I don't want to get
no, it's
us off
okay.
track for the main topics for today.
Yeah. Yeah, but, firing all of your janitors and then forcing members to clean the bathrooms because it's cheaper, that's a pretty exploitative. But as
Well, the
far as
fact
it
that missionaries pay to be the church's salesman, how
yeah,
crazy is that?
exactly. Yeah, their marketing team is the missionary force, and the missionaries pay for the privilege to be on the marketing team.
That's pretty exploitative.
It's
Bishops aren't
wild.
paid,
No.
yeah.
Not only that, but they boast about the fact that they're unpaid, but the top 137 leaders of the church, all men, by the way, they're all paid a salary, their stipend. They've got a housing stipend, a car stipend. They've got a nice little pharmacy situation that they can get whatever sundries they need for free. Probably they get lots of free meals in the Salt Lake area. And they get that $1 million bonus when they sign on. And what I think is interesting about that too is that the 9 women who are in charge of the Young Women's and the Relief Society, none of them are paid.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah.
So it's only the men. But yeah,
Well,
to just go back really quickly to the insecurity piece, because I would argue that the Mormon Church is deeply insecure, and they are terrified that their members are going to find out the truth about their truth claims, about the history of the church, the true history of the church. That's the reason why they hide these things and lie about it, is because of their insecurity.
oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's nothing more arrogant than believing you're God's one true church on the earth and that only you and your leaders speak to God and only your ordinances count, only
Yep.
your baptism counts, only your marriages count. Like there's hard to imagine a more offensive and arrogant position than pure exclusivity, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not only that, but I think the harmful traits manifest in Mormonism when the Mormon Church does things that are maybe unethical or maybe, borderline illegal, like the Ensign Pink Fund deception fraud, which was illegal. I think they do those things because of their entitlement. They believe they're above the law, but they also believe that they're doing the best thing for mankind at all times, because when Jesus comes, everyone's going to find out that the Mormons were right. And it's okay if we, for example, do baptisms for Holocaust victims, because we justify that by saying, in the end, Mormonism is going to win. So it's okay if we do things now that are unethical, just because it's for the greater good in the long run.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's do a Mormon Stories episode where we flesh this out. Does the Mormon
Yeah,
Church meet criteria for narcissism? Let's do that.
Absolutely.
All
I
right.
will. I will. Let's put it
Sorry,
on
I
the
hope I
calendar.
didn't derail today's episode.
No, not at all. I was just thinking, I could clip that section out and it could be its own thing. So just real quick, I want to play a little snippet from a newsreel about Ruby and her arrest, just in case there are people from my audience who don't know Ruby's case quite as well. So here's Sherry Franke, whose book was published, and this is a clip from Good Morning America that we'll just play a portion of so that people can get a real quick review of Ruby and who she is.
She was the Utah mommy influencer known for her no-nonsense parenting.
I'm only going to say it one more time, and then you're going to lose the privilege to eat dinner.
Ruby Franke sharing her life at home with 6 children to her more than 2 million followers on YouTube.
Today, we are starting off our day the way we do every day.
But Ruby's social media empire quickly unraveled when her youngest son escaped in August of 2023. This chilling 911 call leading to her arrest.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here at my front door asking for help. And he's said he just came from a neighbor's house.
Yeah, so I didn't want to rehash the entire thing, but essentially Ruby and her partner, Jody Hildebrand, who are running the Connections classroom, were both arrested. They both pled guilty. Sorry, they're now serving prison time for child abuse, aggravated child abuse. And unfortunately, their sentence was only 30 years or so. John, do you remember?
Well, I thought it was between 4 and 30 years, and they haven't decided yet.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I was thinking if they do go to 30 years.
Then, yeah. The 70s or 80s, right?
Right. So I guess the parole board is the one that decides after 4 years, right? If they get to stay.
Yeah.
I think that's how that works. So I'm hopeful that Sherry's book and some of the larger community discussion about this is going to help them stay in prison longer. Also, I did an episode yesterday where Jody Hildebrand is being sued again by another one of her clients. And it details a lot of the horrible things that those two are doing, which we'll touch on a little bit of that today as we're talking about the comparison between Lori and Ruby. So I think the first thing I want to talk about is, in light of the narcissistic traits that we just went over, in the context of Lori and Ruby's crimes, just talking about the different ways that these personality traits manifested in the commission of their crimes. So maybe just to go back and look at it, and specifically the inability to accept responsibility. I wanted to play a little bit from Ruby's sentencing statement and a little bit from Lori's, just to compare the two. It's pretty interesting to see how similar they are in so many ways. I'm not going to play the whole things again, but just enough to give us an idea.
So far, she has used her time in jail to unwrap the layers upon layers of deceit and deception foisted upon her over the last 4 years by an unscrupulous individual. Ruby realizes that she still has work to do in shedding those thinking errors and to reestablish a better and correct pattern of thinking and behavior. Ruby realizes that changing her thinking, reestablishing relationships, and healing are not simple or easy tasks. However, she is committed to doing that work. I would like the court to know that Ruby Franke is a delightful, respectful, and responsible person.
Yeah, so I started with that statement by her attorney because I just wanted to say it's so interesting to me when someone like Ruby can fool people into thinking that she's a delightful, respectful person. It's that charming nature that a lot of people with narcissistic traits have to portray one personality in public or in front of people they want to impress, but in private they're actually doing terrible things to the people they care about.
Yeah, almost like code switching.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So now let's go to just a brief portion of what she actually says.
I'm so sorry to leave to you to finish what we both started together. The ending of our marriage is a tragedy. And you are wrapped around my heart in a knot I'll never be able to undo.
She's talking about Kevin.
To my babies, my 6 little chicks, you were part of me. I was the mama duck who was consistently watering you to safety. I can see now over the past 4 years, I was in a deep undercurrent that led us to danger. I remember launching into darkness knowingly. I was so disoriented that I believed dark was light and light was wrong. I would do anything in this world for you. My willingness to sacrifice all things masterfully manipulated into something very ugly. I took from you all that was soft and safe and good. I took from you your mother. How terrifying this must have been for you. I'll never stop crying. You're hurting your tender souls. You're so precious to me. I'm sorry.
So John, when you and I watched this the first time, I mean, we didn't watch it at the same time, I don't think, but we commented on our episode about Sherry's book. You and I both wanted to believe that Ruby was really sincere in her apology. And for me, reading Sherry's book completely changed my opinion on that. How was it for you?
Well, yeah. I mean, honestly, if a mom's talking to her kids, apologizing, and the kids don't accept the apology, and the kids are the victims, I'm going to believe the kids every time, right? And
100%.
if you read Sherry's book, there's zero sort of like buying it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Sherry's just like, I'm like, whoa. So that is shocking. And
yeah,
you know, that does push me in a different direction for sure.
Yeah, I think when you start to recognize the ways in which Ruby manipulated situations, people, and her own children, and you see it detailed in the book so well, the different tactics that she uses, it then is easy to see this statement in a new light where she really is not sorry. She's very upset about being caught. She's very upset that she's facing consequences. But I don't think that she regrets any of her parenting choices.
Yeah, when she talked about the end of her marriage being a tragedy, I thought, where did you show that at any point in the timeline prior to that testimony? Like,
Right.
is there any indication that she's like, oh, Kevin, I miss you. Oh, Kevin, this is terrible. Oh, Kevin, I miss you. This is so sad. It's like she was partying up on jet skis in St. George with Jody and the other person, like massage candlelit evenings in freaking Sherry's bedroom. You know what I mean? Like, where was there any hint that she was viewing her separation from Kevin as a tragedy? The other thing I never thought of this before, the language she uses as a mom is being in a deep undercurrent. And that feels like a lack of, I think she was half the undercurrent, right? Like,
absolutely.
She was the undercurrent. She wasn't in an undercurrent.
Yes. She blames Jody for everything. And that was the point that I wanted to get to over here, is that she, when they got arrested, she was already cutting off communication with Jody. She was already in self-preservation mode where she was like, okay, I'm going to say Jody's the one that made me do all of this stuff, that I never would have done it. She totally throws Jody and Jody's teachings under the bus. However, in the book, I just want to quote what Sherry says here. This is so important. Connections is the company that Jody and Ruby formed together to, perpetuate these ideas about mental health and parenting. And Sherry says in her book, this is on page 107, Connections wasn't introducing Ruby to a new way of thinking. It was giving her the vocabulary and pseudoscientific backing to justify what she'd been doing all along. Jody's system had simply slapped a fancy label on this emotional starvation diet and called it therapy. In the end, Connections didn't change Ruby's tactics. It just gave her a manual to refine them. So absolutely, Ruby was already here before, she got into Jody. Jody just, again, gave her some new vocabulary. They did create their own in-speak and Connections. And after reading the chapter about Sherry going through, she details her therapy with Jody. And at the end of that chapter, my note says, Jody gets her clients to engage in self-betrayal and self-sabotage, to not trust their own instincts. They're taught not to self-validate or self-soothe, but to look only to Jody for validation. And Kevin bought it 100%, unfortunately. He really believed what Jody taught him about himself. And that's why when he shows up to the police station to pick up the kids, he says, he hasn't seen his kids in, or his wife hasn't spoken to any of them in over a year. And he says that he was invited to leave. And he absolutely believes that it was his behavior that caused the breakdown of their marriage.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Super harmful. And then, getting back to talking about how this lack of accountability shows up for Lori. This will be a new call for John. So, hold on to your hat there, John. This is something I've gone through in my channel before, but Colby, who is Lori's only living child, he's about the same age as my oldest daughter. He's got a YouTube channel called the Scar Wars podcast, and he's doing some great things. But one of the things he posted was a call with his mom. And this is after Lori's been convicted, and Colby confronts her. And, in Lori's allocution statement, she says, there were no murders here. In fact, I'm going to play just a little bit of that as well to remind people who may not have seen it.
Jesus knows me, and Jesus understands me. I mourn with all of you who mourn, my children and Tammy. Jesus Christ knows the truth of what happened here. Jesus Christ knows that no one was murdered in this case. Accidental deaths happen. Suicides happen. Fatal side effects from medications happen.
I don't know about you, John, but I remember exactly how I felt when I first heard that statement read. I was just completely filled with rage.
So like kids just spontaneously burn up?
I think that's what went through the minds of every single person when we first heard that statement. It was like, okay, if there were no murders, then what happened? How in the world could you possibly explain this? And that's exactly what Colby wanted to know.
Bullets just randomly fly into people,
Yeah, it's wild.
I mean, even with Tammy, which of those things would fit Tammy?
I think maybe Lori thinks that, what was it, fatal side effects from medication? I think maybe that's what Lori was trying to allege in that case.
Is there any autopsy that, what was she, were her vitamins laced with peanuts and she had a peanut allergy? I mean, what?
No, I mean,
what accident happened?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that Tammy did take some supplements and things, but those were all immediately ruled out. Even the first time, her death was attributed to, I believe, a pulmonary embolism at first. And then she later had to be exhumed. And the second finding by the medical examiner was asphyxia at the hands of another. So.
And the fact that Chad wanted no autopsy and to ram the funeral through in a week, right? Yeah. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it was just a few days. It was 6 days after she died.
Yeah, that screams to me, I don't want any evidence to be gathered, right?
Right. Like they
Yeah.
were in Rexburg, her family was in Springville, and he was giving them no time to travel. Their son was on a mission, didn't get to come home. So yeah, they rushed it through, to try to cover that up. So I think it's just, part of Lori's delusion is that if she accepts one fact about the case, then the whole house of cards comes down. And I think that would be psychologically, devastating for her.
And if you show that acronym again really quickly, I'm thinking about just this invocation of Jesus Christ all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
It's an unwillingness to accept responsibility. It's also attention grabbing. It's also very grandiose. I mean, what's more grandiose than invoking the savior of mankind
Right.
into, this murder trial? And she could sound like any Mormon church primary teacher in her testimony of Jesus, right?
Jesus knows me. Jesus loves me.
And
Yeah.
about lack of empathy, like how does she think the surviving family members of the victims feel? Where's her empathy for them when she's just like denying any responsibility and saying Jesus has these people in their arms? And, like it completely lacks empathy for not just the victims, but the surviving family members. It's very manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
And she's exploiting the public media, religion, people's beliefs.
Yeah.
It's very exploitative and manipulative, I think.
Yeah. And this is also, it's important to point out that manipulative people know how to feign empathy. And so when you hear Lori say, I mourn with all of you who mourn, and, did you think that was sincere, John, or could you tell that she was fake crying?
I mean, Ruby did a better job of crying than Lori for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, the feigned empathy is, I know how to say this thing, but I don't know how to actually feel it.
Yeah.
And, I can attest to the fact that there was more than one narcissist in my life, or person with narcissistic traits, who did such a good job of feigning empathy that I really believed that they cared about me. And so that's why it's so important to watch when people's words and actions don't match, So when they say, I mourn with you, but there's no actual sign of mourning or any sorrow or contrition, obviously that's a place where their words and actions don't match.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So now just going back and we're going to listen to this phone call between Lori and Colby. And this call was relatively long. I want to say it was around 50 minutes or so. And, Colby starts with a simple question of asking, what happened to the kids. And it takes Lori around 30 minutes or so to get there, because she's doing all this double speak, backpedaling, explaining, over explaining. And then once she does, it's not a narrative. She starts an explanation, and then she goes and tries to remind people of how much she took care of Tylee and JJ, how much she loved them, what a good mother she was. It's very hard to understand, but I've clipped out this little portion and we can talk about it.
So you imagine walking in, finding them, and they had been gone for hours. There is nothing I can do, even though you just can't imagine. You can't imagine that scenario, because until you live it, you can't imagine that scenario. And when I came in, and I knew Tylee had been upset, and I knew that she was upset with me that weekend, because she wouldn't stay at the house because I would not let Gibb stay there. She hates Melanie Gibb, as you know. Everyone knows this. She hated her. And she couldn't stand her smell because she had the essential oils, and Tylee got sick off the essential oils in 6th grade because her teacher made her drink the essential oils in 6th grade to help with pancreatitis, if you remember all that.
What the?
So she didn't want to stay there. So I asked her to babysit JJ, put him to bed that night, which is what she always has done. right? She was going to bed. I was going to do my podcast with stupid Melanie and Dave, right? So JJ wouldn't interrupt it. And then I was picking him up in the morning to get him ready and take him to school. And when I came in on that scene and they were gone, I thought Tylee did it to get back at me. I thought it was all my fault. I thought she was mad at me, and that's what had happened. And the reason why she visited me and why JJ visited me and came to me right after that is because to tell me that it wasn't my fault, because I was blaming myself 100%. 100%. Why didn't I get Tylee more help? Why did I let her get off of her meds? Why did I not do something different? Why did I let Melanie get to stay here? Why did I do any of these things that would lead to this? How could it possibly have happened? Why and how? Why and how? I mean, you can't even imagine what that is like. No one on the earth can imagine what that's like.
You're telling me that Tylee took JJ's life and then took her own life.
On accident.
And took her own life then? After?
So she says correct. It's hard for you to hear. So your raw reaction, John, this is your first time hearing this.
Why don't you restate for us how you would summarize what Lori just claims?
So that's why I left that Colby part in the end. Lori claims that she asked Tylee to babysit JJ. She claims that Tylee accidentally killed JJ by strangling him, holding him down too hard, something like that, and then killed herself. And I think she's alleging that it was an overdose of some kind, because Tylee had been on medication and then got off medication cold turkey. And so that's Lori's explanation, her convoluted explanation, admittedly, that it's so hard to understand what she's even talking about because of all of the manipulation and doublespeak.
Yeah. So, and I'm just curious, where would Lori be claiming this babysitting homicide and suicide happened?
In her townhome in Rexburg. She said that she asked Tylee to take JJ upstairs so she could do her podcast. And then she claims that she finished the podcast and went upstairs and they were both gone. But we have to remember, it's so
she was home? She was home?
Yes, she was home.
So she claims she was in the house while one kid marries the other and murders the other and then dies by suicide.
Right. And not only that, but Tylee's death date and JJ's death date are 20 days apart. So it's
like
pretty
and these aren't just like a neighbor's kid that you hate. Like, these are her own children. Like, these are her I mean, are these both her biological children?
Tylee is her biological daughter. JJ was adopted.
Right. So, yeah, these are her legal children. One biological, both legal.
Right.
Like, I just can't, like, if one of my kids, any of my kids were dead, I can't imagine being able to appear on a podcast to talk about it. Yeah. I couldn't imagine being able to breathe. Like, I would feel so sick, so devastated, so destroyed, let alone make up a story that implicates them as the perpetrators.
Right.
It is a level of evil that there's no other way to frame it than some sort of severe personality disorder, like narcissism. But I'm just wondering, like, and I know, Megan, I've had you on Mormon Stories to talk about your history growing up with Lori.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any indication that her sickness was so incredibly severe that she would be capable of that phone call with her son, right?
Mm-hmm. So,
Because that's so severe.
yeah.
I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm shocked.
What I think what shocks me the most is that in Lori's behavior, it's no different. You know, we have, you know, typical garden variety manipulations over something seemingly small, right? And then on the very opposite end of the spectrum, we have the murder of your own children, the death of your own children. And the thing that shocks me, John, is that her behavior is the same in both instances. Do you remember I told the story, you know, when I came on Mormon Stories the first time about living in the apartment with Lori and how she kicked me out basically because she didn't like me, you know, going on a date with a guy she didn't even care about. What she did was she saw a situation that she didn't like. She wanted to fix that situation by getting rid of the person who was causing the problem. And in the midst of this, she didn't want to be perceived as having done anything wrong. So what she did is she called her mom, told her mom some story about me being a terrible influence while she's just trying to live the gospel and I'm out drinking every weekend. Mom comes down, you know, gets me to pack up my stuff and leave the apartment. It's the same manipulation that she's engaging in here, where she's convinced herself of a different narrative that gives her no responsibility whatsoever. And then she sort of manipulates the circumstances to try and put the narrative out there as often as she can to explain it away, you know, in order to get people to believe her. And that's to me what's stunning is that it doesn't matter whether it's a routine, you know, friendship, relationship with a cousin, or it's the death of your own children. It's like, these are the tactics that we use in order to perpetuate our delusion so that we don't have to accept any responsibility for any of our own flaws or faults or weaknesses or contributions to the situation.
Yeah. And I can see that. I guess I'm thinking, and I don't mean to minimize the pain and distress I'm sure she caused you in that situation, but I can, you know, I think about like Eckhart Tolle's teaching around pain body and ego, that we can all have ego. We can all lose touch with our values, with our moral center. And we can all sometimes react out of in our emotion brain, let's just say our amygdala, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can all like act, you know, because I can think about it like if Margie and I'll just say, you know, my wife, if we're in a fight and I really feel wronged or righteously indignant because I feel like I'm in the right, I can steel myself to her emotions for a time, and I can like put on a tough face and be cold and indifferent for a time, but it's not more than like 10 minutes. And then she's sad. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought I was right. And now I'm just so sorry. And how do I make this better? And are you okay? Yeah. Even if I'm the right, I'm like, let's figure out a way to make this work. Like you know, even if I have that unhealthy, egotistical, indifferent, narcissistic reaction, it does not withstand my exposure to prolonged anguish.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why but then if it's your own kids and it's murder and they're dead, like I would just think I wouldn't even be able to rise to any sort of tuning out my pain, my anguish, my own guilt. Mm-hmm. So I guess in my mind, the severity of the circumstances we're talking about with Lori they're so high that it's just hard for me to imagine someone capable of that level of indifference and deception and blame, and all the elements of the of your beautiful acronym. You know, it stretches the imagination.
Yeah, it really does. What I have to remind myself too, though, is that leading up to these tragic events, Lori had spent kind of a lifetime you know, treating Tylee in a certain way. You know, mothers who have these personality traits can't accept their child, especially their female child, outshining them. And so there were lots of ways in which Lori kept Tylee small. She body shamed her. You know, we believe that she probably was making Tylee sick. And that's why she was constantly in the hospital with symptoms of pancreatitis. And then once she and Chad got together, they both engaged in a campaign to dehumanize these children and to dehumanize Charles and to dehumanize Tammy by saying they were possessed, you know, they had these evil spirits. And so once you've engaged in that level of dehumanization, it makes it easier and easier to ignore the empathetic feelings that you're talking about, John, where most of us would feel compassion for suffering, and they're just not capable of
Or
it.
guilt.
Right. Which is, you know, now if you take these personality traits and you add that sadistic feature where you enjoy the suffering of other people, that's where it strays into psychopathy.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think we saw that from both Ruby and Lori, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jody.
And Jody, exactly. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit just about the idea of feeling above the law or feeling entitled to a certain experience in life without having to go through some of the things that, you know, normal, ordinary human beings go through. That entitlement piece, I think, is what leans both of these women to believe that what they're doing is okay and that they're never going to get caught. And I guess you could probably say that of a lot of criminals, but, you know, that entitlement piece, I think about my growing up in Mormonism and how, you know, we've been talking a little bit about that arrogance, that specialness feeling. I'm wondering how much that leaned towards them feeling as though the rules didn't apply to them. So I think that there's also this idea in Mormonism that you and I have talked about where the family, my family specifically, portrays one, you know, set of behaviors in public and then in private, something completely different. You know, there's different rules for public and private. And I think when you grow up learning that, it definitely lends to this idea that I get to pick and choose which rules I'm going to follow.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's prevalent in most Mormon families?
I mean, ironically, my family blew up when I was in middle school because my parents got divorced, and it was kind of a bit of a public issue because there was a disciplinary council, and we were kind of a prominent family in our stake, or at least semi-prominent. My dad was like on the stake presidency, stake high council kind of thing. I'm really fortunate that we had a family that didn't try and hide our weaknesses or our imperfections. And maybe that's just because it all got blown up so early on for me. My older siblings were already out of the house when all this happened. But yeah, I think it's a classic hallmark of the average Mormon family to have perfect hair, you know, coiffed, you know, whatever, ironed dresses and suits with ties and sitting all in a row on the pew on Sunday. You got to look perfect. You got to look like Donnie Marie Osmond with the perfect smiles, perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfectly behaved. And, you know, don't talk about your weaknesses. Don't show imperfections. And keep the dirty little secrets quiet and contained, because it could affect your status. And I think that's for sure not a exclusively Mormon trait, but it's certainly one of the most toxic and pervasive Mormon family traits that I think wreaks untold psychological and physical damage to the membership.
Yeah, I agree that it's not uniquely Mormon. I do know lots of other, you know, religious families and families who are prominent in communities who do that. I mean, we've seen that with, you know, on display with politicians' families and all of those kinds of things throughout our nation's history. But I think for me, it's comforting for me to know that my family wasn't the only one that was like that. But at the same time, it makes me think, well, what are these other families hiding? You know, if my family was hiding deep, dark secrets, you know, what else don't we know? And I think this is one of the ways that abuse gets perpetuated in the church as well, is that there's a desire to cover up anything that makes the church look bad, makes church leadership look bad. And I think you're right, a damaging psychological effect on the individual people, because at the very least, there's a cognitive dissonance about, you know, leadership hiding things and being dishonest about the reality of their lives. And, you know, the idea that man, we're trying so hard to be perfect, but it's pretty impossible to live up to all of those Mormon ideals, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel bad for parents and children caught up in that toxic cycle, because not only is it toxic to your mental health and your physical health, it's a huge inhibition to just healthy, fulfilling, meaningful relationships. Because we all know from the work of Brene Brown that vulnerability is sort of, I like to call it the gasoline in the engine of emotional intimacy.
Yeah.
When you can say, I'm struggling, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm angry, and you can or you hurt me, or whatever it is, right? Or I'm sorry I hurt you. That type of vulnerability leads to deeper understandings and deeper connection and deeper relationships. And so aside from the toxicity, it just it malnourishes people from having the types of meaningful relationships that are really life-giving and life-sustaining.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. If we can't share our true selves with the people that we love and care about the most, then that connection really never deepens.
Yeah.
Well, so just to wrap up this idea of, you know, sense of superiority, I think both of these women claimed on multiple occasions that they were led by God, or that they felt prompted or inspired to do these behaviors, to, you know, to act in this way. You know, we know Lori had a special mission. Sherry says in her book that Jody Hildebrandt believed that she was called by God, led by God, to have this type of a therapy practice where she supposedly is integrating faith and therapy. I don't know necessarily that I have any instances where Ruby claimed that she was on a special mission from God, but I do know that the Brethren, you know, encouraged us back in the early 2000s, us women, to be a better example online of living righteous lives, and encouraged us to, you know, to do blogs and to get out there on the internet. Do you remember that, John?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I mean, the church was super late to you know, the internet.
Yeah.
But eventually they realized you gotta get our act together. And so I remember multiple times in the 2000s, 2010s, where the church would fly influencers to Salt Lake City and hold all day roundtable meetings where they're not only learning from them, but then encouraging them and even paying them to do social media posts and engagements and activities that would benefit the church. Not to mention the whole I'm a Mormon campaign,
right,
where the church encouraged all members. They created a website, an entire infrastructure for Mormons to go on social media and bear their testimonies about the church. Don't ignore the fact that now it's considered a victory for Satan to even use the identity marker as Mormon.
Yeah.
But just 10 years ago, it was all the rage, and it was a multi-billion-dollar initiative by the church to do whatever it could to bump out antagonistic voices on the Mormon internet and replace it with sort of good-looking, stylistic, glamorous mommy bloggers and mommy vloggers, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Did you ever have an I'm a Mormon page, John? Did you put your testimony online?
No, I was way past that point by the time that came out. I was still a member.
Yeah, you were PMO though, right? Physically and mentally.
Yeah, I was really struggling with the church's views on women, on people of color, on LGBT people. And anytime I told people I was Mormon, I would always say I'm Mormon with an asterisk. And I would say I'm not homophobic, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist. And the church embarrasses me in many ways, but I'm Mormon.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Mormon like a secular Jew is Jewish, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I definitely had my I'm a Mormon page. It's probably still out there. Although did they take all that down in the wake of the victory for Satan?
Oh yeah, that's all down the
Okay.
memory hole for
Oh,
sure.
good.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, because if we were to translate in modern parlance, that campaign was called "I'm a Victory for Satan."
That's right. Just
I'm a Victory for Satan campaign.
Just the very word of it, right? Oh, goodness. Well, let's move on to the next topic that I have here, which is, temptation and the devil. In the Mormon church, we're taught that Satan is always trying to tempt us and always trying to, convince us to do something wrong. And I remember this little visual of one of the authorities at one point said that anytime you make a decision, Jesus is fighting for you and Satan is fighting against you. And who's going to win the war? Who are you going to allow to win the war? So there's this sort of abdication of some part of responsibility just because Satan is always trying to influence you. If you do something wrong, it's because Satan got a hold of you, right? If you break your covenants in the temple, you're going to be in Satan's power. And so, I don't know how much Lori and Ruby would identify with, blaming the devil made me do it kind of idea. However, both women seem to blame supernatural forces for some of their actions, at least, rather than themselves. I know that Ruby claimed that her children were evil, and Lori the same. Her children were dark, and so rather than saying, maybe I need to dig into this as a parent and figure out what's going on with my kid, blaming the fact that they were possessed. I don't know. What do you think about that, John?
Yeah, I think I was trying to think of like top 5 or top 10 reasons why Mormon true crime keeps happening.
Yeah.
And I think this teaching of demonic possession has got to be in the top 5,
Yeah.
And the problem is it starts with Jesus.
Mhm.
Like Jesus is the one that casts the evil spirits out of the man into the pig, and then the pigs run off the mountainside. Like, how do you, given that most of the America's super Christian, how are you going to trash Jesus's own teaching? So of course the Mormon church, especially now that it's more Jesus focused than it's ever been, what are you going to do with that teaching of demonic possession? You're stuck with it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's one of the most harmful teachings. And of course, whether it's Tim Ballard, Ruby Franke, Jody Hildebrandt, Lori and Chad, it's just, how much havoc does that teaching need to wreak? Visions of Glory, Tom Harrison, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
We need to okay, if the church wants to fight transgender people or feminists or, people who love history, go for it. But while you're at it, fight people that believe in demonic possession, because it's literally killing way too many dentists and orthodontist wives in Mormon land,
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody was asking me the other day if there's an uptick in Mormon crime or if it's just an uptick in society recognizing it. And I do think things like, the Mark Hoffman documentary on Netflix and the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, making Mormonism more culturally interesting. I think certainly that calls attention to the crimes, maybe perhaps more than others. They would not point out the religion of someone else, for example. But I don't know if there's an increase in the commonality of Mormons committing crimes, or if it's just that we're calling more attention to it. But there definitely seems to be behind each one of these crimes some distorted thinking that can be drawn directly back to, if not the doctrine itself, a distortion of the doctrine, an expansion of the doctrine.
And to me, this is where the church, I think, actually is complicit in crimes, because we talk about these traits of narcissism like grandiosity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, once you're taught that your feelings are God communicating to you through the Holy Ghost, and that's literally every Mormon from the time they're 0 years old, they're taught that God communicates to you through your feelings via the Holy Ghost. And they're taught the story of Nephi, that God, communicated with Nephi through his feelings and told him to chop off the head of, his drunk, passed out adversary, Laban. Like, once those stories sink in, and once that theology sinks in, then you don't just, you don't have to be a narcissist to start believing and acting like a narcissist, because once you believe that your feelings and thoughts come from God, then you've got license. You've got license to literally do whatever you want, because God is commanding you through the Holy Ghost to your feelings. And I am very convinced that if the church stopped teaching that we could discern God's will by what we feel, but we even talk about audaciousness or grandiosity, to think that any mortal human could know the mind and will of God at any moment, that
Right.
in and of itself is grandiosity.
Yes.
So, but once you've absorbed that, then anything goes, and God approves it, and God likes it, and God wants it. And so I really can see, that's why I wonder whether it takes harmful religious theology or doctrine to create a Lori Vallow. Because if she really started believing that her thoughts and feelings were from God, it's almost like creating schizophrenia, where you believe in the delusions. And if she believes that God declared her kids zombies, or that God declared Tammy a zombie, or that God needed her children or Tammy on the other side, then she's just obeying God. She's not a murderer. She's
Right.
an obedient, righteous daughter of God. How dark is that?
Yeah, super, super dark. And I mean, so follow me down this line of thinking, right? Narcissistic traits are developed by an individual as a mask for shame and insecurity, as an avoidance of shame and insecurity. And if all the church does is shame us for who we naturally are as human beings, for having sexual thoughts and feelings prior to marriage, just for being a human being, for
Getting divorced,
being
a single mom, having multiple divorces, right?
Right.
Never
So
feeling good enough.
Right.
Sexual shame.
We can never check all of the boxes. We never can, because the list is too long and we're too human to be able to do it. So the church fills us with shame. And then some people who don't know how to process or deal with that shame will develop these types of of shame avoidance techniques in order to avoid feeling that pain all the time. So, for example, the only reason that people, or not the only reason, but one of the reasons people manipulate others is because they don't believe that they really could get what they want or meet their own needs, right? And so if I'm somebody who's coming up in the church, I've been filled with shame and I don't know how to process my emotions or how to self-validate or how to self-soothe, because I've been taught that the church is the only one that can provide that for me. I have to look to Jesus to heal my wounds. I have to give my burdens to him. There's nothing I can do on my own. And so, it's reasonable to understand how lots of people develop these types of tactics and traits for shame avoidance in high demand religion.
Yeah. And of course, I'm hearing the apologists scream and say you can't blame the church for creating murderers. There's X million Mormons that don't murder their kids. And that's all true. I'm not saying that the Mormon church is to blame for Lori and Chad's murders per se. But I think there's an argument to say that Mormon doctrine and theology are complicit in contributing to those murders and to Ruby and Jody's behavior. Because
right.
if we want to switch it to Jody and Ruby, again, sexual shame, inadequacy, two women beat down and devalued by a patriarchy, just groveling for some type of status or legitimacy. And then they find this vulnerability of male sexual shame, and they're able to gain power by developing this horrific business model, almost as sort of a Mormon quasi-feminist retribution, where they can gain their power, punish men, uppower themselves, downpower the men, and do it all in the name of God and Jesus and moral purity, right? Like, how could I'm very convinced that Jody and Ruby believed that they were the only ones that could cure the sins of masturbation or pornography or infidelity or whatever.
Yeah.
But that it took the type of tough love that Nephi wielded upon Laban, or that the Israelites, that God told the Israelites to wield upon the Canaanites or whoever they committed genocide upon in the Old Testament. Like, harsh sins require harsh measures. And if Ruby's kids just failed to, where much was given, much was required. And if they failed to comply, then you just ratchet up the punishment, because God, was communicating to Jody and Ruby what the pure form of child discipline was, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that brings us to this lawsuit that was recently filed against against Jody and Ruby, against Connections. There are several people named as defendants. But one of the things that is listed in the lawsuit are a couple of excerpts from Ruby's journals. And I know those exist in other places, but it's just kind of convenient to have it all here in the lawsuit. So I want to share this really quick as well. This is from page 25 of the lawsuit, number 107. It says, Franke's journal entries reveal that this horrendous criminal behavior was not separated from Hildebrandt's teachings and the enterprise, but in reality, Hildebrandt's methodology implemented to the highest degree possible. And so it says, these are Ruby's journal entries. If victim one was to emulate the savior, he needs to be 100% obedient with exactness, no wavering, no hiding. B, I told victim one he needs God. I invited him to fast and pray. C, the devil doesn't like when you get your subject to agree to truth, which was their version of reality. Truth is their word for reality, basically. And then I just want to skip down here a little bit to the part that is relevant to our discussion. Letter F, boundaries will show you how much demonic possession a soul has. The more boundaries, the more the soul will reveal itself. So they believed in, putting all these boundaries up for their kids, knowing that the stricter they were, the more the kids would reveal how much demonic possession they had. And then if we want to skip down to letter P, It says the world we live in today does not support children being uncomfortable, for example, in pain. And so children are comforted, entertained, distracted from the need to confess and change. Stripping down a child's world to the basics of beans and rice and hard work would be considered abuse. And yet that's exactly what she was doing. And so the next one says, it's been 3 months of consistent boundaries and putting up with his terrorizing. She's talking about the child terrorizing her to get victim one's confessions out. Who would do this in a real world? I don't know of anyone who would feed their kid in America beans, lentils, rice, and chicken for 3 months straight and refuse all distractions. And this is why Americans are so full of sin and are ready for destruction. So she's basically intimating here that only she and Jody have the solution for how to properly discipline a child, and that it's necessary for them to go through this painful process and basically torture and abuse in order for the child to confess their sins. And we're talking about minor children here. We're not talking about teenagers, even there were, 10 and 8, I believe, at the time they finally escaped. So, back to that demonic possession piece, back to the idea that, that there's some unseen force affecting the children, and that this harsh treatment of them is the only way to get them away from that unseen force. And that brings us all the way around to Visions of Glory.
Let me pull it out. There it is. Visions of Glory by Tom Harrison, otherwise known as John Pontius.
Yeah, so John Pontius was the author, but he was the as told to, and Spencer in Visions of Glory we know as Tom Harrison, who we know worked with Jody in coming up with the Eternal Core Conference, which was a way of marrying therapy and religion. And we know how harmful Tom Harrison's influence was on Chad Daybell. And, we've been down that rabbit hole a couple of times for hours, but it keeps coming up over and over. And it's mentioned in Sherry's book that Jody and Ruby absolutely believed what was being taught in Visions of Glory. And it was sort of this hyper focus on the end times, on doomsday prepping, that made me wonder whether or not Ruby and Lori to some degree might have suffered from religious scrupulosity, because that hyper focus tended to take them in a dark direction. So I'm curious about your thoughts, since you're an expert on scrupulosity. Can you speak to, what behaviors that we saw in Ruby and Lori that would exhibit that or exemplify that?
Yeah, I was really, really encouraged. I don't know, I feel like I introduced the term scrupulosity within a Mormon context to the world, and it was kind of by accident. In 2008, when I was applying to Ph.D. programs in psychology, one of my colleagues, Andrew Armstrong, just said, "John, have you heard of the term scrupulosity?" And I'd never heard of it before. And, he was in this research lab at Utah State University studying obsessive compulsive disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, scrupulosity is one of the, main flavors of obsessive compulsive disorder. And I'd never heard of it. So when I got accepted into the Utah State psychology program in 2009, I decided to develop a treatment for scrupulosity, because, I had this longstanding interest in religion and Mormonism, but I had to do something around OCD because that was the clinical interests of my advisor. So I developed a treatment for scrupulosity between 2009 and 2011 with my professor, Michael Tuig. And that was my master's thesis, and acceptance commitment therapy as a treatment for religious OCD or scrupulosity. And we published the results of that study. And, it's a really important thing for people to understand scrupulosity is sort of this obsession with religious purity, of religious cleanliness. It's also, you could think of it as heightened guilt or heightened shame, that goes far beyond any norm into the level of clinically, significant. So feeling so much guilt and shame all the time about relatively benign things, that you're praying constantly, that you're praying for hours at a time, that you're calling your bishop to confess multiple times a week, that you're ruminating constantly about your worthiness.
Would
they're
attending
all
the temple every single day fall into that category?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that's Lori, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Taking things way too literally, becoming obsessed with hyper righteousness, all of that type of stuff would be traits. I was really encouraged to see that Sherry was aware of the term scrupulosity, that
Yeah.
she mentioned her own. I don't have to diagnose her. She mentioned her own diagnosis in her book.
Mm-hmm.
That was the beginning of, that felt really good to see that the term has penetrated Mormon consciousness to the point where Sherry, in her own Orthodox Mormon bubble, would be aware of that term to the point where she would not only know that she met criteria, but that she would talk about it in her very successful memoir.
Right.
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I wouldn't guess that Lori exhibited signs of scrupulosity as a teen and as a young adult based on what you've told me.
Right.
So I wonder if it was for her later onset scrupulosity, which actually isn't probably normal. Normally OCD really, it emerges in early teens. It flares up in the late teens and early 20s, and then it starts dissipating by the early 30s. So if we were to theorize that Lori may have met criteria for scrupulosity, well, number one, it would mean that she felt potentially extreme feelings of guilt and shame. And that doesn't totally align with this idea of lack of empathy, lack of compassion, lack of insight.
Yeah.
So I do, I'd be curious to your thoughts on that. Did she have a conscience at all to then experience scrupulosity?
Yeah.
What do
Give
you
me
think?
1 second. I'm going to let my dogs out because they're obviously making noise over
No
here.
worries.
Give me 1 sec. Sorry. That was a great question. And it's one that I've thought about a lot, because people, when I first started talking about Lori, people would ask me, has she always been religious? And I would always laugh and like, no, she wasn't. I noticed a significant change in Lori in the early 2000s when she was divorcing Joe Ryan. That's when I noticed, hindsight, of course, at the time, I didn't know how to frame it this way, but hindsight, looking back on it, I noticed an uptick in her manipulative behavior. I noticed that she was trying really hard to put her narrative of the divorce out there and to get nobody to talk to Joe and to get everybody to be against Joe. And this is one of those tactics of manipulative people, is that they try to isolate and triangulate, so the person who is the subject of reputation destruction, the manipulative person doesn't want anyone talking to them because they don't want their side of the story to get out. So that's kind of when I noticed an uptick in her manipulation. And then the next thing that we sort of hear from Lori is that she's going to her bishop post-divorce and saying, I'm either going to turn my life to the temple or I'm going to murder my ex-husband, and I'm sure he thought she was kidding, sort of tongue in cheek. But that was right around the time that she started getting interested in near-death experiences, and probably when she started upping her temple attendance as well. So I think the combination of, her sort of turning up the knob on her manipulation and control, along with the near-death experiences, which maybe did make her feel some sense of I don't know if it was guilt or shame, or if it was like maybe just a fear that she was going to miss out on the celestial kingdom, if she didn't turn up her religion and, and do better as a Mormon. So I think that's kind of when she strayed into that area of like starting to go to the temple every single day, listening to podcasts, going to all of these outside conferences, trying to, as they put it in the temple, seek further light and knowledge. And, that's the other part of this that I think I want to explore just a little bit, is like the Mormon church encourages us to go out and get our own personal revelation about things for our lives, right? And they encourage us to read all of the Deseret books and, to look at other faithful sources for light and knowledge. So I'm sure that a lot of these people who were attending these conferences were thinking that that's what they were doing. They were just going the extra mile. What are your thoughts on that?
You may find this interesting, and I hope this fits with the redirection you just made to me. I went to ChatGPT because I was curious what ChatGPT would say about this, and I basically said, by your best analysis, would you theorize that Lori Vallow exhibited traits of religious OCD or scrupulosity? And here it's really interesting, the response it gave. So it said some of the signs of scrupulosity that are connected to Lori could include, number one, excessive religious fixation. So Lori's fixation on apocalyptic prophecies, visions, rigid frameworks of righteousness versus evil, believing she was part of the 144,000. That fits with excessive religious fixation.
Mm-hmm.
The second would be moral and religious perfectionism. People with scrupulosity usually have a fear of being impure or unworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it mentions her fear that her children were possessed by dark spirits, which I don't know if that was a fear or a cover, but it gets more interesting. Religious rituals and compulsions. So, scrupulosity involves compulsive religious behaviors, such as repeated praying or seeking reassurance. It says, while Vallow did not demonstrate classic OCD rituals like excessive prayer or confession, her constant seeking of validation from Chad Daybell and others may indicate a compulsive need for religious certainty. That's what it says.
Yeah.
Then it's got delusional versus obsessive thinking. This is interesting. There's the term ego syntonic and ego dystonic.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard those two terms before?
Yeah.
Okay, so if it's ego dystonic, it means that you've got these intrusive thoughts, but you don't want them and you don't think they're real.
Right.
And somebody with scrupulosity, an example would be a woman who thinks she molests children, even though she knows she doesn't, but her brain keeps telling her that she is molesting children, or that she's not gay, but because she has OCD, she has thoughts that she might be gay.
Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't want those thoughts, or she doesn't want to think that she molests children. Those would be ego dystonic thoughts, consistent with the scrupulosity diagnosis. It says Vallow's beliefs appeared ego syntonic. Ego syntonic is when you like the delusions or the disturbing thoughts. And ChatGPT says that Vallow, her beliefs were ego syntonic, making her case more aligned with delusional disorder, religious fanaticism, or narcissistic traits rather than pure OCD.
Yeah.
So it basically summarizes, while scrupulosity has some overlap with Vallow's behavior, her case appears more consistent with delusional disorder, narcissistic traits, and religious extremism rather than classic OCD. Scrupulosity sufferers typically feel guilt and distress over their obsessive religious thoughts, whereas Vallow seemed confident and unshaken in her apocalyptic beliefs. So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of interesting.
It is really interesting.
So
Yeah.
ChatGPT says no on the scrupulosity for Lori
no
Vallow.
no on the scrupulosity. That's interesting.
And I think ChatGPT got this right.
I agree. And it also brings up another point that I was thinking of earlier, is that I have yet to find a difference between the Holy Ghost and confirmation bias. And the other thing that I think is difficult, problematic, troubling about the Mormon Church's teachings about personal revelation and the Holy Ghost are that if you have a mentally ill person who wants to believe that they're a god, for example, Lori Vallow, then of course their feelings of the Holy Ghost are going to confirm to them that that's true. So it's like you're saying with, that syntonic thought of Lori's, that she wants to be special and important and a goddess. And so she thinks she is. And so then she prays to God and says, am I a goddess? And she feels good about it. So that she believes that's the Holy Ghost telling her. So that's just my point, is just that if you have individuals who already have a tendency towards mental illness, or who already have a tendency towards grandiose thoughts, the idea that God is confirming that to them is really harmful. It's almost like making their mental illness worse rather than, giving them opportunities to think in healthier ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So as far as Ruby's concerned, with her religious scrupulosity, did you ask ChatGPT about Ruby as well?
No, but I think Ruby potentially, she seemed to have, I definitely think she exhibits some narcissistic traits from an early age. But I could envision some of her behaviors as explainable as sort of neurotic perfectionism and even religiously motivated neurotic perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that a bit more. What do you think? I'll ask ChatGPT now and see.
Okay.
What do you think?
Well, while you're asking ChatGPT, I will mention that when Jody's lawsuit came out, I started doing some research, and I came across the Connections podcast, still available on Spotify. Although I could get it on my phone, but not on my computer for some reason. So I went and downloaded a few of the episodes. And one of the ones that really stood out to me, because I was curious about what was going on with the podcast while these children were being tortured in Jody's house. And the timeline is that in May of 2023 is when Jody and Ruby moved with these two younger children down to Ivins, Utah, to live in Jody's mansion. And they did lots of podcasts during that time period, but there were just a few right there at the very end. And podcast number 235 is called The Parable of the Pineapple. And it was recorded on July 22nd of 23, which is just 1 month before they were arrested. So that those kids were already in quite a bit of distress when this was going on. But the podcast talks about a past episode with her children where she put her 4-year-old son and her 6-year-old daughter on the couch to watch a movie while she went to take a nap, because she was 9 months pregnant and she needed a nap. So she was expecting the children to stay on the couch and not move for a whole hour. And she told them, don't go in the kitchen. So she goes up to take the nap. She comes back down. The movie's still playing. They're sitting on the sofa. She's like, oh, I'm so relieved. You did what I told you to do. And then she relates going into the kitchen and her feet were sticking to the floor. And she goes into great detail about how sticky the floor was. And she says, so I did what any mother would do, which I'm thinking to myself, I would probably just get a cloth and clean it up and maybe ask the kids if they know what happened. But no, Ruby gets down on the floor. She smells the sticky spot to see if she can tell what it is. And because she can't discern the smell, she literally licks the floor.
Wow.
And she figures out that it's pineapple juice on the floor. And so she confronts her kids. Neither one of them say anything. And she said, all right, fine. I'm going to stand right here until you tell me what happened, because I know the two of you were down here and it couldn't have happened any other way. So I'm just going to stand right here. And she said, finally, her 4-year-old son confessed to her that he had gotten some pineapple from the fridge and spilled pineapple juice on the floor. And so she says that, you know, she brings the kid into the kitchen. They get some hot soapy water. She makes sure that he understands how big of a mess this is and what he's done. And they get on the floor and they scrub and they clean. And she said not only did they do the floor, but then they went under the cabinets and on the baseboard. And she was showing him the little spots of pineapple juice on the baseboard and how they had to scrub those off. And then they went to the bar stool and they looked at the legs of the bar stool and saw that there were pineapple splatters there, and then made him scrub those off. And I was thinking, man, this is kind of reminding me a little bit of OCD, you know, where you have this fixation about removing every single spot of pineapple juice from everywhere. And, you know, she engages in quite a lot of, you know, really harmful talk during this. So I'm going to do another episode where I can detail it and play it for everybody. But to me, you know, I was thinking this idea and what keeps coming up in the lawsuit too is like this perfect obedience, this exactness about everything. Those were kind of some of my thoughts around why I think she might have some of those traits.
So I'll give you the verdict.
Okay.
So regarding, I'll just cut to the summary. Ruby Franke showed some traits of scrupulosity, according to ChatGPT, especially rigid morality and fear of divine punishment. I was just going to say, I don't think she showed rigid morality. She showed the enforcement of rigid morality on her children. But anyway.
Yes. There's a big difference between those two things.
Yeah.
Rules for me, but
yeah,
you know, whatever.
But it says, however, her certainty, lack of visible distress, and authoritarian parenting suggests that extreme religious fundamentalism, narcissism, and abusive control played a larger role than OCD. So that's interesting. I didn't prompt ChatGPT to even think about narcissism. Yeah. And yet it basically says not really scrupulosity, but definitely narcissism. And I had to ask about Jody Hildebrand as well. Yeah, it basically says her extreme focus on morality and sin aligns with scrupulosity, but she lacks the doubt, anxiety, or self-punishment typically seen in religious OCD. So for ChatGPT, Jody's just a clear no on scrupulosity. What it says is she exhibited authoritarian and cult-like behaviors, emphasizing absolute control over her followers, forcing individuals, including Ruby's children, to confess sins and undergo psychological torment, using her authority to manipulate others rather than seeking reassurances for herself. Her rigid, high control mindset suggests cult psychology rather than OCD. She positioned herself as infallible, and she lacked, again, excessive guilt. She was more about enforcing purity on others. And clearly she had the double standard of the, I don't know, homoerotic massages with other women in Sherry's bedroom.
Yeah.
You know, but then if a 15-year-old boy touches himself or a 30-year-old man touches himself, he's a pedophile that needs to go to prison. You know what I mean?
Right. And while we're on the subject of Jody, let's just go ahead and mention the fact of this false morality that she had, this inflated sense of her own worthiness and righteousness, because we know that her license was revoked. Her therapy license was revoked in 2012 when she reported Adam Paul Steed to the BYU Honor Code office, breaching client confidentiality and HIPAA laws and all of that. So her license was suspended, and then she went on to practice the same principles, but just called it life coaching instead. Not only that, but she also moved in with more than one of her patients / clients, which is hugely unethical as far as, you know, therapists are concerned. That's definitely not something that, you know, there's a lot of ethics training around treating individuals for their mental health. And that definitely goes against all the ethics training. So, you know, this idea that she's above the rules, she gets to pick and choose which rules she's going to follow, which ones are going to be important to her. And, you know, that's just another one of those markers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to mention while we're on this subject too, though, there's another cluster B personality disorder that sort of overlaps. There's a little bit of a Venn diagram overlap with OCD and narcissism, and it's obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which I've dealt with people with this disorder as well. And it was so enlightening to finally have this as a marker, because it's like, well, this doesn't fit, this does fit. Like, how do I understand this person? And I think that probably Ruby had some of these OCPD traits as well. So for OCPD, the personality disorder, there's perfectionism, there's preoccupation with detail, excessive work and productivity. I think that fits for Ruby. Order and organization, reluctance to delegate due to the belief that others won't meet their standards, miserliness, or I also call this, what do you call it? Parsimonious. That's the word. Just not wanting to save money because focusing on future catastrophes rather than enjoying life. Stubbornness and inflexibility, like that black and white thinking, the inability to, make different plans when something happens, or to change ideas or anything like that. And then their relationships suffer because they're so controlling. So I think there's some aspects of that to what Ruby does as well.
Yeah. Yeah. OCPD is, one thing that people often do is they, if somebody is neurotic or super organized or super clean, or high attention to detail, they'll call them OCD. And that's fine. It's normal that we're going to, if somebody's sad, they're going to say I'm depressed, even if they don't meet criteria. So I'm not like going to make a big deal about that. But if we are talking about being precise, so lots of people are going to be neat and tidy and organized and care about what they do, and try to do the best that they can. That doesn't necessarily meet criteria for OCD or OCPD, right?
Right.
That could just be a high achieving person, right? Who's conscientious. OCD is when you have intrusive thoughts that are highly distressing, like I'm going to get sick and die. Someone's going to murder me. I'm a pervert. I'm a sexual deviant. When those things aren't really true or realistic, it's just stuff your brain is telling you. And it's so distressing that you develop compulsive behaviors to neutralize the anxiety of the intrusive thoughts that are coming in your brain. So whether it's flipping light switches, checking the stove to make sure you turned it off, obsessively washing your hands, counting things, confessing to the bishop. These are all compulsive behaviors that both seek to neutralize the stress and anxiety of your intrusive thoughts, but they also get in the way of your life. Like you can't get an OCD diagnosis unless it's impacting significantly your work or your school or your relationships or your mental health. So that's category 1. That's OCD. Category 2 is OCPD. And OCPD is quite different than OCD.
Right.
And if you'll put that list back up for just a second, I think it's really important. Maybe go up just a little bit to the up
to the top.
Yeah. Like, okay, you're a perfectionist, right? But oftentimes you're a perfectionist for other people. And this excessive work and productivity, that's not OCD. Like OCD people are so dominated by their disease that they're not productive at work. They're not getting things done because their life is in shambles. And order and organization, it turns out that hoarding is a subtype of OCD. And there's going to be a lot of people with OCD that can't do basic hygiene, let alone maintain a meticulous house because their OCD is so pervasive and suffocating. So
Does it take
again,
them away from being able to complete other tasks because the OCD is what they have to pay attention to first?
yeah, that's literally why you would ever obtain a diagnosis is it's just destroying your life, right?
Yeah.
There's no such thing as like, I mean, you could say high functioning OCD, but no, not really. Like you wouldn't meet criteria if it weren't causing you significant distress where it was getting in the way of basic life functioning.
Right.
So yeah, if you're super ordered and organized, you're either high functioning conscientious or you're OCPD, right? But I think it's really interesting that it lists interpersonal relationships suffer because of their controlling behaviors, lack of empathy, inability to compromise. That absolutely sounds like, consistent with Ruby and potentially Jody as well. And I don't know about Lori and Chad. I'm not sure about OCPD with Lori and Chad, honestly.
Yeah, I don't think that I got that vibe from anything that Lori and Chad were doing. I think they definitely fall much more under the category of that grandiosity. The sort of the classic narcissist that we all think of is the one who is very boastful, just inflated with their own self-importance, doesn't really care about other people, those kind of traits. And I'm glad that there is a more comprehensive conversation about narcissism going on in the world today. Dr. Ramani Durvasula just published a book called "It's Not You." She's got a hugely successful YouTube channel where she talks about all things narcissism. And honestly, that's where I first started learning about narcissism and narcissistic traits. So for those of you who have people in your life that exhibit some of these traits, her channel is a great resource to go to find out how to deal with these types of people in your life. And then also I have my bully proof course, which we can talk about later. But I really appreciate your perspective on this, John, because, understanding the inner workings of this, I think really helps people to identify these behaviors, not only in other people, but in themselves too.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have good understandings of mental health and of treatment for mental health. And that's part of the reason I never actually intended to practice as a psychologist. I wanted the education, I wanted the training, I wanted the scholarship, the research, the experience, but it was only a backup for actual career. But I felt like I'd be a more effective podcast host if I got the training and the education, and it's been really useful. And I'm grateful when anybody is trying to talk about mental health, because we would all do better to increase our understanding,
Yeah. And speaking from experience as someone who has been interviewed by you multiple times, I really think that you do bring a level of compassion and understanding to your work that a lot of other, people in this space don't really have. It's one thing to interview someone. It's another thing to understand their experience and to be able to ask those deeper, more meaningful questions, because you understand more of the dynamics around their personality style and around, some of the harmful behavior they've encountered. And certainly being able to point out the harmful behaviors of the church, I think, takes a little bit of understanding of mental health. Because for me, I think one of the reasons why it took me so long to come out of the church was that I didn't really understand manipulation and control. And once I did, I couldn't unsee it in the church and in the culture and in the leadership. And so that information helped me to realize that even if the church was true, I wouldn't want to be part of an organization that was this manipulative and harmful to its members.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess so. The basis, the reason for me always wanting to talk about this is because, when religious beliefs go sideways, sometimes it has tragic outcomes, what like was the case with my family, unfortunately. But I just think there's a broader implication for all religious communities when any of the teachings are misinterpreted or taken to extremes. We've seen religious extremism hurt people a lot in the past. I'm just curious if you have any final thoughts on those ideas, and what do you think we can do to make it better?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think talking about it like we are is really useful. So I'm really grateful that you've taken an interest in narcissism. I don't think we talk about narcissism enough within a Mormon context. I think the Mormon Church would meet criteria as a narcissistic organization. I think Mormon patriarchy is heavily narcissistic, and I think that bleeds into how the Mormon family order often plays out as sort of a narcissistic family order. And then I think that breeds a lot of narcissistic men and women. So I'm really grateful for the education you're bringing to me and to our community just around that one diagnosis. And then, from there, I do think it's good for us all to have these sorts of conversations and to engage with others, to learn as much as we can. But unfortunately, it's sad that we're kind of preaching to the choir a little bit, because if you're watching your stuff or mine or, Hidden True Crime or any of the other people out there, you probably have had to give yourself a crash course in mental health because of the ways that unhealthy church or family dynamics have wreaked havoc in your own life and in your own relationships. What would be amazing is if we could help push these conversations into mainstream Mormon discourse more.
Yeah.
But I think we'll get there. And what you're doing, it plays an important role. So I just want to thank you, Megan, for your leadership and for your work in this area. And I'm really honored that you would let me come on the show and brainstorm with you a little bit.
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate your contributions to my work and to my understanding, and for being such a great mentor and being so generous with your time. So thank you for being with me.
Well, how about we mentor each other? We're mutual mentors.
Yeah, that sounds great. A mutual appreciation society.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Megan. Best of luck. And thanks to your audience.
Yep.
And you guys can find me at mormonstories.org. You can email me at mormonstories@gmail.com. And if I could ever help anyone with anything, please let me know.
Yeah, well, I'm always going to put a plug in for Mormon Stories podcast. And I've said this before, but I will continue to infomercialize this. The LDS discussion series on Mormon Stories podcast was instrumental in me being able to deconstruct my Mormon faith in a healthy way. I felt for me it was necessary to analytically go through every single thing I had been taught and learn the truth about it. And that series did that better for me, I think, than I ever could have done on my own with research. It's a fantastic series. I highly recommend that you go listen to it. And also, I recommend that you sign up as a monthly donor for Mormon Stories podcast to pay for the value of that crash course in deconstruction, because it, for me, was absolutely as valuable as any college course I ever could have taken. So please go and donate, become a monthly donor to Mormon Stories podcast.
Well, thank you, Megan. How do people donate to you?
Well, my people know I have a Venmo. I've got a Patreon. I've got some membership changes coming up right now, but probably the best way right now that you can support my channel is to subscribe. And that's absolutely free. I am almost up to 10,000 subscribers. So let's hopefully get up there.
That's great.
Yeah, almost there.
Yeah,
I want to hit
subscribe.
that. My goal is to hit 10,000 before my 1-year anniversary, which is on April 6th. So I think we can get there.
You got it. You got this, Megan.
Yeah, absolutely. So go share this episode with anybody you think needs to hear it. Please like the episode. Please comment to boost the engagement. And as always, take care of each other, but more importantly, take care of yourself. We'll see you guys again soon.